A mother pressed her infant against her chest and ran toward the River as the air itself caught fire. It was February 13, 1945, and Dresden, a city that had survived the war almost untouched, was about to become an inferno. What happened over the next 48 hours would haunt the conscience of the Allied powers for generations. But the full story of why Dresden burned and what it revealed about the nature of total war would take decades to fully emerge. And when it did, it would force uncomfortable questions about what democracies become when they believe they're fighting absolute evil. Dresden had earned its nickname through centuries of cultural accumulation. The Zwinger Palace, with its baroque architecture and world-renowned art collection. The Semperoper, one of Europe's great opera houses. Churches, museums, and libraries that drew scholars from across the continent. By early 1945, the city's population had swelled from 630,000 to perhaps over 1 million. Refugees from the east flooded westward, fleeing the advancing Red Army. Trains arrived daily, packed with families carrying whatever they could salvage from homes they would never see again. Dresden seemed safe. It had no significant military industry, no major troop concentrations. The city's air defenses had been stripped and sent to protect more strategic targets. Many residents believed an unspoken agreement protected their city, a gentleman's understanding that some places were simply too beautiful to destroy. They were wrong. Arthur Harris commanded the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command with a single-minded conviction. Area bombing, the systematic destruction of German cities, would break civilian morale and end the war. Harris had watched the Blitz devastate London. He had no moral reservations about returning the destruction tenfold. By February 1945, Allied strategic bombing had already flattened Hamburg, Cologne, and dozens of other German cities. The Soviets, pushing toward Berlin, requested attacks on communication hubs in eastern Germany to disrupt German troop movements. Dresden appeared on the target list. But what followed went far beyond disrupting troop movements. The plan called for something more ambitious, something that would demonstrate the overwhelming power of Allied air supremacy, something that would, in Harris's words, show the Germans the meaning of total war. The orders were issued, and no one in Dresden had any idea what was coming. The first wave arrived at 10:13 p.m. on February 13th. 244 Lancaster bombers from the Royal Air Force dropped high-explosive bombs to blow open buildings, exposing their wooden interiors. Then came the incendiaries, hundreds of thousands of small magnesium devices designed to start fires that couldn't be extinguished. The city's firefighters responded as best they could. Then, 3 hours later, the second wave arrived. 529 more Lancasters, dropping their payloads onto a city already burning. The timing was deliberate. The gap allowed rescue workers and firefighters to emerge from shelters. Then they too became targets. The firestorm began around 1:30 a.m. When fires grow large enough, they create their own weather system. Superheated air rises, pulling oxygen inward from all directions at hurricane speeds. Temperatures at the center reached 1,500 degrees Celsius. People who sought shelter in basements suffocated as the fire consumed all available oxygen. Those who fled into the streets were caught in winds strong enough to rip children from their mothers' arms. The next morning, American B-17s arrived. 311 bombers continued the assault in daylight. P-51 fighters strafed survivors along the riverbanks. Some pilots later claimed they were targeting military personnel. Witnesses on the ground described something closer to massacre. Counting the dead proved nearly impossible. Bodies had been incinerated beyond recognition. Entire families vanished without trace. The initial German reports claimed 200,000 dead, a figure that Nazi propaganda amplified for obvious reasons. Modern historians, working from burial records, missing persons reports, and population data, estimate between 22,000 and 25,000 deaths. Some place the number as high as 35,000. The true figure will never be known. What is known is this. In 48 hours, 1,250 bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of explosives and incendiary devices on a city filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and civilians who had believed themselves beyond the war's reach. Approximately 1,600 acres of the city center were destroyed. The baroque masterpieces, the libraries, the churches reduced to rubble and ash. Bodies lay in the streets for weeks. Mass graves were dug. Eventually, the remains were simply piled in the city's central square and burned. Winston Churchill had approved the bombing. By mid-March, he was already distancing himself from it. In a memo to his chiefs of staff, Churchill wrote that the destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. He questioned whether the Allies should continue bombing German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror. The memo was quickly withdrawn and rewritten in softer language, but the original survives in the archives, evidence that even as the fires still smoldered, doubts had begun to surface at the highest levels. Arthur Harris never wavered. He defended Dresden until his death in 1984, insisting the bombing was a legitimate act of war. Many of his air crews felt differently. Some refused to speak of it. Others carried the weight of that night for the rest of their lives. Was Dresden a war crime? The question has no easy answer. International law in 1945 offered murky guidance on aerial bombardment. The Hague Conventions prohibited attacks on undefended towns, but what constituted undefended in an era of total war? The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, but declined to examine Allied bombing campaigns. The victors write the laws as well as the history. Critics argue that Dresden had no military significance that justified its destruction. The refugee populations, the historic architecture, the lack of air defenses all pointed toward a city that posed no threat. Defenders counter that Germany had initiated terror bombing with the Blitz, that Dresden contained rail yards and some industrial facilities, that shortening the war by even a single day would save countless lives. Both arguments contain truth. Neither fully answers the deeper question, what are the limits of acceptable violence when a democracy believes it fights for survival against genuine evil? The ruins of Dresden stood for decades as a monument to destruction. The Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, remained a pile of blackened stones throughout the Cold War, East Germany's reminder of Western barbarism. After reunification, an international effort rebuilt it stone by stone. The restored church was consecrated in 2005. A British organization donated the Golden Cross atop its dome. The son of one of the pilots who bombed Dresden was among the craftsmen who helped rebuild it. History rarely offers such symmetries. The Dresden firebombing forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about the nature of warfare. Democracies are not immune to atrocity. When nations convince themselves they fight absolute evil, the boundaries of acceptable violence expand in ways that later generations struggle to comprehend. The men who planned Dresden were not monsters. They were bureaucrats and military professionals operating within a system that had normalized the incineration of civilians as a tool of policy. That normalization is perhaps the most troubling legacy of all. Dresden burns still in our collective memory, a warning about how easily moral certainty can become moral catastrophe and how the fires we light in war continue to flicker long after the last embers have cooled.